Hi, this is the recording to accompany the slides for the lecture on pH balance. So let's begin. In this slide, we have the overview of what we're covering in this lecture. So we're going to go through the basics of pH, why pH imbalances occur. We're going to look at how that pH imbalance is corrected with the use of these three different types of buffers, and then we're going to look at arterial blood gases and how you determine someone's pH status. So this is the only chemical reaction that you'll need to know, and then these are the symptoms of acidosis to the left and the symptoms of alkalosis to the right. So when we look at pH, or acid-base balance, what we can see is that the understanding of pH is different in terms of what's considered neutral, acidic, and alkaline when we talk about pure water versus when we talk about what are normal pH levels in blood versus acidic pH in blood and basic pH in blood. So in water, we all know that pure water, neutral pH is 7, and everything less than 7 is considered acidic, and anything greater than 7 is considered basic. In blood, what happens is normal pH is a range, and it ranges from 7.35 to 7.45. And so anything below the lower end of this is considered acidic. So anything below 7.35 is considered acidic, and anything above 7.45 is considered basic. So if you have pH of 7, that would be considered neutral if we're talking about pure water, but that would be very acidic when we're talking about blood. And the reason why there is a range for normal pH in blood is that as blood goes through the systemic cells, what happens is hydrogen ions are produced as part of the metabolic process, and that hydrogen ions decrease pH, right? So as you increase the number of hydrogen ions, pH decreases. So that's why when you look at these figures over here, the pH of venous blood is lower than that of arterial blood, because then what happens is the cells produce the hydrogen ions, release it into blood, and then it's carried in the venous blood. This chemical formula down below is very important because it gives you the relationship between carbon dioxide, bicarb ions, and protons, acid, right? So you can see here carbon dioxide and water combine in the presence of carbonic anhydrase enzyme to actually produce carbonic acid, and carbonic acid dissociates into the bicarb ion and hydrogen ions as well. So what happens is that as the levels of carbon dioxide increase in blood, then it is proportional to the increase of proton concentration in blood, and then therefore it lowers pH. Acid-base balance is one of the most vital homeostatic mechanisms in the body. Many processes depend on the precise regulation of the hydrogen ion concentration, such that slight deviations from the normal pH, so anything less than 7.35 or more than 7.45, could be fatal. So when you look over here, the first point is that activity of the sodium-potassium ATPase pump falls by 50% when pH decreases by 1 pH unit. And remember, the sodium ATPase pump is very important in maintaining differential ion concentration inside the cell versus outside, as well as to ensure that nerve function remains healthy. The other thing with maintaining pH balance is that when there is a change in pH concentration, what happens is normal proteins can become denatured. And what you can see here is that with denaturation of a protein, it loses its 3D shape and therefore loses its function. The good news is that the denaturation is not permanent, so it can be reversible when those extreme conditions are reversed. And so it can be reversed to form normal protein with normal shape and therefore normal function. In terms of where acids and bases come from, they come from the food and drinks that enter into our digestive tract and are absorbed. Metabolic wastes are mainly acid, and also the lungs help to remove over 30 liters of carbonic acid each day from the venous blood when we actually breathe out. So when we breathe out carbon dioxide in the air that we breathe out. So that helps to eliminate the acid and the hydrogen ions in our blood. This is a concept that you probably have never come across before. This is called the base bicarbonate to carbonic acid ratio. And so what you can see here is that the normal pH and acid-base balance depends on a base bicarbonate to carbonic acid ratio of 20:1. And that 20:1 can be either 20:1, 40:2, which maintains the ratio, or 10:0.5, right? So the ratio is there, whether it's 20:1, 40:2, or 10:0.5. The enzyme carbonic anhydrase is present in a lot of different places. It's present in red blood cells to help to transport carbon dioxide. It's present in the stomach to help to produce gastric acid. It's present in the pancreas to help to produce the bicarbonate ion. And it's also present in kidneys to help to regulate acid-base balance, right? So what happens is if you have, say you have the base bicarbonate to carbonic acid ratio of 20:1 is normal. If base bicarbonate to carbonic acid increases, what happens is there's more base bicarbonate. And so what happens is pH increases, and then you can enter into alkalosis, right? If the base bicarbonate to carbonic acid ratio decreases, that means that the denominator increases, so there's more carbonic acid relative to the amounts of base bicarbonate. And so that means that the pH drops and you enter into a state of acidosis. So we'll revisit that concept towards the end of the lecture. So why do pH imbalances happen? pH imbalances can happen either because the respiration changes in terms of the rate, like it either becomes, you either breathe faster or slower, or the depth. You either take deep breaths or shallow breaths. And those changes of respiration rate and depth can affect the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and therefore pH balance. The other reason why acid base imbalances occur is that there might be something going on metabolically, or there might be something going on in terms of the amount of acid that comes into our body or the amount of acid that leaves our body. And that will change the bicarbonate concentration and therefore the pH balance. So if those changes are because of changes in respiration rate and depth, it's called respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis, right? Respiratory acidosis occurs when the partial pressure of CO2 is greater than 45 millimeters mercury. Respiratory alkalosis occurs when the partial pressure of CO2 is less than 35 millimeters mercury. If the changes come about because of some changes in metabolic process, intake or output, then what happens is that the bicarbonate levels will change. And if the bicarbonate levels drop below 22 units, then acidosis occurs, and because it's changes in the metabolic or other processes, it's called metabolic acidosis. And again, if it increases to a level above the normal range, so above 26, then it's alkalosis, right? And because it's due to changes in metabolic processes or input or output, it's called metabolic alkalosis. Bicarbonate level in blood is largely controlled through the renal system, while the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is largely controlled by the respiratory system. So what we have over here is we have pH, we have the normal range, 7.35 to 7.45. Anything below normal pH is acidotic, anything above normal pH is alkalotic. Normal range of partial pressure of CO2 is 35 to 45 millimeters mercury. Anything below that is either respiratory alkalosis. Anything above that is respiratory acidosis. And again, we're going to talk about respiratory compensation in a bit. In terms of the bicarb concentration in blood, normal range is 22 to 26. Anything below that is metabolic acidosis. Anything above that is metabolic alkalosis. And again, we're going to talk about metabolic compensation in subsequent slides. This diagram over here, I think this is the third time that it's appeared in this lecture. You can see that the symptoms of acidosis affects the central nervous system, respiratory system, heart, muscular, and digestive system. And you can see over here how how alkalosis affects the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, muscular, and digestive system, right? So what you can see here is that it does affect the central nervous system and muscular and digestive system in different ways. When the respiratory system causes imbalances, this is what happens. Again, this is an opposite thing. So respiratory acidosis is opposite to respiratory alkalosis. So you can learn just one. Obviously, the causes are unique to respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis, but everything else is a inverse image of the other. Okay, so respiratory acidosis can occur with things like pneumonia, emphysema, congestive heart failure, or drug overdose, which inhibit respiration. So what happens with respiratory acidosis is that the cause is really one of these conditions, which then leads to hypoventilation. So with hypoventilation, breathing rate slows down as well as breathing depth. And what happens when breathing rate slows down is that CO2 cannot leave. And so CO2 levels in the body build up, right? Because the amount of carbon dioxide that can leave goes down. And so carbon dioxide levels go up, and it results in hypercapnia. Again, hyper means increase, cap refers to CO2, and emia is in the blood. And then what happens is because the CO2 levels increase, carbonic levels increase, and so you have a higher denominator, so the BB to CA ratio goes down. And because the pH decreases below normal due to changes in respiration, this is called acidosis and respiratory because it's due to changes in respiration. Respiratory alkalosis is sometimes caused by fever, mental stress, hypoxia, or infections. And what happens in either or any of these cases is that breathing rate and depth can increase. So when you have an increase in the breathing rate and depth, it's called hyperventilation. And as you breathe faster and your depth increases, then more CO2 leaves the body, less remains in blood. So you end up with hypocapnia. And what happens is the amount of carbonic acid is decreased, and so the BBCA ratio increases, right? So what you have is you have an increase in pH above normal, which then results in alkalosis. And because it's due to a change of respiration, it's called respiratory alkalosis. The next two conditions is caused by metabolic or other changes. So we have metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis. So metabolic acidosis can be caused by diabetic ketoacidosis when diabetes is not managed well, by aspirin overdose, by strenuous exercise, uremia, diarrhea, starvation. So in either of those cases, what happens is the level of acids in the blood can increase. So when the levels of acid in the blood increase, the BBCA, the carbonic acid levels increase, so it decreased the overall BBCA ratio. And then that leads to a decrease in pH. And so the decrease in pH is acidosis, and it's because it's due to changes in metabolism or other changes, it's called metabolic acidosis. Metabolic alkalosis is caused by excessive antacids, which then neutralizes the stomach pH, laxative, diuretics, severe vomiting, Cushing's disease. These all help to increase, to decrease acid levels in the blood, right? Because if you vomit, then what happens is you vomit out the gastric acid. So what happens is the carbonic levels go down. So the BBCA ratio increases because you have a smaller denominator. pH increases above normal. So that's where alkalosis comes in. And because it's due to changes in metabolism or other changes, it's called metabolic alkalosis. So again, I hope that you can review this slide and the previous slide just to understand what metabolic alkalosis is compared to respiratory alkalosis and metabolic acidosis compared to respiratory acidosis. So now we come to the next lot. And the next topic is if there is a pH imbalance, what systems actually try to get it back to normal. And so you've got these three homeostatic mechanisms that help to maintain pH within a very narrow physiological range, right? And so what happens is you have the fast, medium, and slow response systems. So the fastest response system are buffer systems that exist in the blood or inside cells. And these are chemical buffer systems. And they kick in within seconds, so pretty much immediately, and they prevent drastic changes in pH and drastic changes in the proton concentration. The next homeostatic control mechanism is the respiratory response system. This is only activated if the first chemical buffer systems are not enough, are not adequate. It takes a couple of minutes, a few minutes to actually kick in. And what happens is the respiratory response system adjusts the rate of breathing as well as the depth of breathing. The third and final homeostatic control mechanism is the renal response system. It's much more powerful, but also slower acting. So it takes hours to days. And what happens is it works in the kidney, in the renal system, and it does it by adjusting the excretion of either acid or bicarbonate in the urine. So again, what happens is in response to acidosis, right? In response to acidosis, when you have an increased amount of hydrogen ions, what happens is then the chemical buffer systems kick in to absorb the excess protons. If that's not enough, then what happens is breathing rate and depth speed up to try to get rid of the excess acid through the exhalation of CO2, right? And then if that's not enough, then what happens is the excess acid is secreted in urine by the kidneys, and so the urine becomes acidic. The response to alkalosis is when you have too much acid being removed. Then what happens is that the chemical buffer systems release hydrogen ions to actually add to the levels of hydrogen ions in the blood. Respiration decreases in terms of rate and depth in order to conserve CO2, which then increases the amount of hydrogen ions in the blood. And then the kidneys increase the secretion of bicarbonate and keeps the hydrogen ions that's produced. So let's go through each of them individually over here. So with rapidly acting chemical buffers, what happens is the blood pH can change either due to the foods that we eat, digest, and absorb, or with cell metabolism. Chemical buffers act rapidly. They don't prevent pH changes, but they do help to minimize them. So, for example, if you add a strong base to a solution without a buffer, what happens is pH will increase by quite a lot. But with a chemical buffer, what happens is pH might increase just a little bit. The strong base gets converted to a weak base. Along the same vein, when a strong acid is added to a solution, what happens is pH can drop quite drastically. But in the presence of chemical buffer, pH will drop a little bit, and the strong acid then becomes a weak acid. Buffer pairs are present either in the plasma, in blood, or inside the cells, right? And it exists in pairs, so it consists of a weak acid and a basic salt of that acid. So in the next slide, we go through some of the most common chemical buffers that exist. So we've got the protein buffer, which is the most important buffering mechanism inside cells, whereas the other ones exist mainly in plasma. So what happens is that the proteins contain positively charged amino groups that can bind to hydroxyl ions, and negatively charged carboxyl group that can bind to protons, right? So that's the most important buffering mechanism inside cells. Outside of the cells, you've got these three buffer pairs. So the first one is in hemoglobin. We've got the enzyme carbonic anhydrase that converts CO2 to bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So you can see it over here, right? So CO2 plus water gets converted to carbonic acid, which then dissociates into bicarb and hydrogen. And these are reversible reaction. We also have phosphate buffers that help to convert strong acids into a weak acid and salt, or helps to convert strong base into a weak base and water. The bicarbonate carbonic acid buffer, again, converts strong acid into a weaker version of itself, and a strong base into a weaker version of itself as well. The second homeostatic control mechanism is the respiratory response system. So what this is based on the rate and depth of respiration. So as you breathe out quicker, as you breathe quicker, what happens is more CO2 leaves. If you breathe slower, more CO2 stays in blood, right? So what happens is if there is a decrease in pH, acidosis, what happens is it triggers the respiratory system to increase the rate and depth of respiration to cause hyperventilation. And then what that is it causes more CO2 to leave, so less CO2 remains in blood, and then the blood then becomes more basic to return it back to normal pH levels. So this is what happens during acidosis. Respiration rate increases, so CO2 leaves, the amount of CO2 in blood decreases, the amount of carbonic acid decreases, pH increases back to normal. With alkalosis, when you have an increase in pH in blood, again, it stimulates the receptors in the brain and in the arteries, and it causes respiration rate to slow down. And when respiration rate slows down, less CO2 leaves in respiration, and so more CO2 remains in blood, more carbonic acid remains in blood, pH levels drop back to normal. So when we look at this, we have the compensation of respiratory acidosis on the right and the compensation of respiratory alkalosis in the left. So this is what happens when, on the right, when you have hypoventilation causing an increase in partial pressure of CO2, causing respiratory acidosis. And what happens is that the buffer system kicks in to accept hydrogen ions. If that's not enough, then the respiratory system kicks in to increase respiration rate to try to kick out more CO2. If that's not enough, the renal compensation kicks in to secrete hydrogen ion and to produce more bicarbonate ions that are kept in the plasma. So with all these three systems, what happens is pH then drops back to normal. With respiratory alkalosis, what happens is respiratory alkalosis is caused by hyperventilation. And with hyperventilation, what happens is more CO2 leaves, so partial pressure of CO2 in blood decreases. And when that happens, chemical buffer system releases more hydrogen ions. If that's not enough, then the respiratory response system acts to try to decrease, to slow down breathing rates. If that's not enough, then the renal compensation kicks in to try to generate more hydrogen ions, which then leads to increasing pH of the blood back to normal. So again, these are two very good diagrams to actually study and to actually work out the flow of what's going on. The third response system is the renal response system. So what happens is, depending on the pH of blood, you can have either more or less protons being excreted in urine, or more or less bicarbonate ions being reabsorbed into blood. So let's do this. If pH is too low, then you enter into acidosis. And with acidosis, because there's too much hydrogen ions in blood, we need to kick out some of them. So what happens is more hydrogen ions is excreted in urine, and more bicarbonate ions is reabsorbed back into blood. When pH is too high, that is called alkalosis. We need to conserve more hydrogen ions. So what happens is you have more staying in blood, less hydrogen ions being excreted in urine, and less bicarbonate ions being absorbed into blood. And the way that this happens is through these four related mechanisms. So the first one is the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. So what happens is the sodium-potassium ATPase pumps moves sodium against its concentration gradient from the epithelial cells in the proximal convoluted tubules out in towards the blood, right? So in exchange for sodium leaving the epithelium cells, you have potassium entering in, right? So sodium leaves, potassium entering in. Now, the interesting thing about the sodium-potassium ATPase pump in the kidneys is that hydrogen ions, this potassium pump the potassium ions that returns can be substituted with hydrogen ions. So instead of potassium returning in, then hydrogen ions can also return in. With this sodium leaving, what happens is then we want more sodium to actually enter into this way. And so this is driven by the sodium proton pump, right? So what the sodium proton pump does is it pushes or excretes hydrogen ions into the tubule, the lumen of the tubule, while bringing sodium out of the lumen of the tubule back into blood, right? So hydrogen ions are excreted and there. And then what happens is that you have carbonic anhydrase enzyme in the epithelial cell as well as in the tubule, and that helps. And again, remember, it's reversible, right? So the carbonic anhydrase enzyme can either convert CO2 and water into carbonic acid, and which then dissociates into bicarb or hydrogen, or it can go the other way, right? So you've got the carbonic anhydrase enzyme acting in these two places. When it does act in the epithelial cells, what you do is that then hydrogen ions are produced, that's excreted, bicarbonate ions are produced, that is reabsorbed back into the blood, right? And in order to balance all the increase in sodium ions returning into the blood, we also have the reabsorption of chloride in order to neutralize the cation, which is the sodium entering into back into the blood. So you've got chloride following where sodium goes in order to neutralize the cations. The last part of this lecture, we'll talk about arterial blood gas analysis. So this is a lab test of blood taken from an artery rather than a vein. It provides information about the patient's respiratory status and key information about the status of the acid-base homeostasis through levels of pH, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, as well as concentration of bicarb in the arterial blood. So you can see there are 5 different values that are measured in ABG for the purpose of the pH. We're not going to look at partial pressure of oxygen or oxygen saturation of hemoglobin. So we're only going to be focusing on the first 3 values. So we looked at this before. So normal pH of blood is 7.35 to 7.45. Anything less is acidosis. Anything higher is alkalosis. Normal partial pressure of CO2 is 35 to 45. Anything less is alkaline. Anything more is acidic. Normal bicarb concentration is 22 to 26. Anything less is acidic. Anything more is alkaline. So, how does this work? When we've got these 3 different values, what you have is you focus on the pH and then the other 2. So when you get the pH levels, if the pH is within the normal range, either everything's normal or there's something wrong, but it's fixed, right? So that's what completely compensated is, right? So completely fixed. If it's less than the lower end, so if it's less than 7.35, the person is in acidosis. If it's greater than the higher end, greater than 7.45, the person is in alkalosis. Now, whether or not acidosis or alkalosis is respiratory or alkalotic depends on the next 2 values. So what happens is when you look at the next 2 values, if it's in the same direction as the pH, then that is the cause. So, for example, if the pH is, say, 7.3 and CO2 levels, partial pressure of CO2 is 47, then it's in the same direction. This is acidic, this is acidic. And so this would be called respiratory acidosis. If pH is acidic and the bicarbonate level is, say, 20, then what happens is that's in the same direction as pH. And so this would be metabolic acidosis, right? So let's go through a couple of examples to see how that works. So Sam has arterial blood gas values of pH of 7.3, partial pressure of CO2 of 40, and bicarbonate levels of 20. So let's see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a highlighter and look at this. So pH of 7.3 is less than the normal range. So what this shows is that Sam has acidosis. Now, let's look at the other 2 values. So the other 2 values are partial pressure of CO2 is 40, and 40 is right in here, right? So what the partial pressure of 40 means is that it seems to be in the normal range. And when we look at the 3rd value, the bicarbonate levels, what we can see is that the bicarb levels are 20. So normal range is 22 to 26. 20 is less than the lower end, so it's in acidosis, right? And so it's in this way. So what happens is that Sam Sam has got metabolic acidosis, and because there's no change in the partial pressure of CO2, then it's not being compensated. Because what happens is that his breathing rate and depth probably isn't changed. And so there's no compensation yet, right? So that's what happens. So acidosis, we know it's the bicarb is in the acidotic range, but the partial pressure of CO2 is in the normal range. So it's metabolic acidosis, no compensation. Let's look at another one. So this one, the pH is 7.1. So again, in the acidic range. So this means that Pat has acidosis. PCO2 is above normal. So is in this range. And bicarb levels are in the normal range. So again, this shows that Pat has got respiratory acidosis, that is not being compensated. Last example, we've got Lee. pH levels are above the high end of normal, so alkalosis. CO2 levels are below the normal range, and bicarb levels are below the normal range. Okay, so what I said was that Lee would have alkalosis based on his pH, and because because PCO2 values are in the same direction as the pH, that is the cause, right? So Lee has respiratory alkalosis, and because if you look at the bicarb levels, it's either metabolic acidosis, which he doesn't have, or they don't have, and because it's in the lower end of normal, it's compensation, so renal compensation. So with renal compensation, we will look at more examples in class as well as in other places so that you can fully understand.